As of right now, we can say that the book industry is a dying market, and there is actually no way to resurrect profit incentives from selling paperback books anymore. People will still have access to, say, ebooks in PDF files behind a paywall, or buy expensive college textbooks from academia marked up to $300, $400, but nowhere in our culture today worships paperback books anymore, or at least learn something from it. Instead, you're finding this incredibly pretentious cat lady, neoliberal, stay-at-home mom force that believes in its own ideology to, wear a mask and vax up, as they would like to say. But one individual by the name of Ben Arzate is still reviewing the most obscure works of punk literature, alt-lit zines, and has made an intersection between what is left of those who still are novelists and what is written. And it is important to study and understand where literature or the novel is going and how artists may express themselves using such of a paperback format. Ben Arzate has the interest of reviewing other people's books and as well writing his own in that kind of alt-lit bizarro canon. Let me explain further. So Ben has his blog at dripdrip.blogspot, I believe. But you can Google search his name, and he is always frequently a reviewer of such interesting and strange books. And always you can find an opinion on something he has in his enormous library of sorts. He runs a Twitter as well, and he is very active on Twitter, and as well as that, he is pretty much always looking for something to review or something to expose, and that is, of course, the curious mind of a book reviewer, is to always find the next fix. If you had the audacity to review a new book every day, that itself becomes a job, a hobby, and as well as a fulfilled enjoyment on its own, almost as a profession and whatnot. Ben also has a series of books that he has released in the past 4 years. I mentioned in one of his books, The Story of Why, as I am actually thanked in the back of that book, Francis Nally, and I respect Ben for doing that, as I looked over the draft at the time when I was busy getting into graduate school, and I gave him feedback for that. Ben has also appeared on some of my older Pilleater podcasts as well, and if you dig deep into the Pilleater archive, you might find a long stream I did 3 to 4 years ago where he appears. But his books are very interesting, and I strongly suggest any of my students buying one of his books and reading where he's coming from with his own novelist style. There's also a reoccurring joke too about Arzate is that he lives in Iowa, and Slipknot is from Iowa, and I believe he said this as well in 2 podcasts before. But I've never been to the state of Iowa, but it is interesting to say you're from a remote part of the United States and be into this very strange, bizarre canon of sorts of extremist literature. Me being from Pennsylvania is also a very strange thing too. I take shame being from Pennsylvania. I just wish I was in somewhere else than here, But I never like to talk about my background in Pennsylvania. But Ben has the confidence to say, well, I live in Iowa and I'm in the most extremist, interesting books of all time. Again, I strongly recommend looking over and reading The Story of Why. It's a great novel, and you can kind of get, Ben's work really good, in a nutshell, what he's talking about in his own novelist expression. But I want to digress here and say this is what the novel is about. It's kind of this artistic pleasure, this expression where the author can reveal himself into different medium of a third person, first person format, and we can learn morals or ethics, or not even that, or sometimes just expression. Doesn't even have to have morals and expressions. And the written word becomes kind of like that of an abstract painting, or that if we're smart the written English language can be like examining what's happening in a painting. And our criticism, the basis of understanding the English language, or any language for that matter, is an expansion of the mind And it's kind of like, I would think it's very similar to understanding the Chinese language. That sometimes Chinese, literally what dog means is the picture it shows. We see a picture of the dog, then that letter must mean dog. This kind of picture language. And that's the power of language, is that people have to be literate in order to send more sophisticated art forms. And understanding sometimes at the end of the day, a CalArts cartoon erotica is very shallow, and a book of describing this in sentence can be more expressive than a painting in itself. And that sadly has gone away from our society as we're becoming more low IQ as every year passes by, and we're becoming dumber and dumber. So Ben comes from this interesting tradition of looking at extremist literature or outsider literature. Anita Dalton has a great book called Too Long Didn't Read, The Best of Odd Things Considered, which her blog details and categorizes the most strangest books she's been to. And the basis of such of these books are there's this fad about how books are censored. How can anyone ban literature, Stammesdat literature, against the state? And then when we do encounter such literature, we don't even have the audacity to read the most weirdest things outside our comfort zones. And that tradition, I think, started around the late 80s to early 90s. You see, there was this guy named Adam Parfrey, and he had a publishing house called Feral House. He was friends with Boyd Rice and Jim Goad. And, those people, Peter Sodos, and those individuals who worked in power electronics to punk hardcore to the avant-garde of industrial music, where Parfrey suggested that books should be outsider stuff and more offense to hurt someone's comfort zone. And that if we were really smart liberals, and liberalism assumes that we're smarter, we're centrist, we're neither left-wing, we're right-wing, we're these kind of intellectuals that we can judge the text without offense, then we would be able to consume in Feral House stuff and know about the verboten, the forbidden. And, I got to interview Adam Parfrey before he died, actually. And when he died, I did an RIP video, and I believe his sister, Juliet Parfrey, called me a robot for some reason. But, and I've also heard stories about Boyd Rice being on his deathbed. But nonetheless, Parfrey's Feral House pretty much influenced much of the reactionary sphere of the internet. And there's still cults and fans of the post-Feral House canon. Let me explain further. I believe when Feral House went out of favor, there was 3 divisions. First, you had Greg Johnson's Countercurrents, which dealt with Nazi paraphilia, extreme white nationalism, basically far-right culture, because if liberalism thinks that the Holocaust and the Nazi narrative is the most evil thing you can do, well, embracing the far-right or the National Socialism, Nazi Germany as a subculture, we could understand things further. And that itself is its own extreme canon. However, Countercurrents is unapologetically white nationalist and believes in this paternal ethics that we should strive to this esoteric white nationalism. You also had a publishing called Nine Banded Books by Chip Smith. And Chip Smith comes from the tradition of Feral House that reading books, the liberal kind of jaded Gen X liberal slacker who read Feral House, he's continuing that tradition through Nine Banded Books. And that, we should have access to the freedom of the press. The same when Adam Parfrey was publishing The Gates of Janus with Colin Wilson and Peter Sodos. And so Nine Banded Books really comes from a direct descendant of that. It'll sometimes flirt with far-right literature stuff, but, to equal it out, just so whatever offends the liberal classes, that's there, How far can that go? And in recent times, you have Matt Forney's Terror House, which is also a direct interest of Feral House as well. And Matt Forney's project was more of an answer to the alt-lit scene that was becoming more and more ever liberal, where you have Sam Pink making interesting zines of sorts, but then kind of bowing down to this liberal slackerism of punk gentrified culture. And Terror House wants to get that post-alt-right reactionary sphere and find out the best people in the literature scene and into the anti-liberalism and applying to that audience. So Terror House, Countercurrents, and Nine Banded Books all have one thing in common. They came from Adam Parfrey's Feral House, and they continue to do so in that name. And to make a wraparound, this is where Ben comes in, Ben Arzate, and to this day, Ben still does book reviews of these strange and verboten books. One I remember just recently coming across was The Extermination Zone by Dr. Randall Phillip, and Ben reviewed it. It's a very hard zine to come across, and it's this typical answer me transgressive punk scene, but Ben has always been what is coming out of the transgressive scene, what is the real forbidden, the criminally active, the one you're not allowed to touch. I mean, you could intersect it to the whole power electronics, metal kid, transgressive scene for sure. But Ben will also review the likes of, Al Stankard and such. And I believe he has a copy of some of my books as well. The point being is that Arzate is the fine balance between book reviewers who do care about where the alt-lit scene is going, and the complete freedom of authorship, of writing what you want, of self-publishing, not caring what anyone has to say. Ben is always on that and wants to be exposed to such and wants to give it a good review, or at least a review, and wants to read it. So as long as there's people like Arzate, we can have a scene of people where it's the post-alt-lit that's like a circle. People have a certain genealogy of interest of the pre-Feral House scene. And I think people should read more into the works of Ben Arzate on his Facebook, Twitter, and his recent book reviews, because whatever fringe book you think is out, Ben probably has it in his library. So I'll conclude it at that, pick up an interesting transgressive book and look from there. So class dismissed, and thanks for listening.